today to hear testimony on protecting human rights in international conservation. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearing are limited to the chairman and the ranking member or their designees. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and helps members keep their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, that is so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at the following email address, hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with our in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. So as with in-person meetings, members can only be muted by staff if it's necessary to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses who experience any technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. So I'll begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Our hearing today will focus on human rights and Indigenous rights in conservation projects around the world, funded in part by the United States government. In 2019, BuzzFeed News published a series of investigative reports focused on the mistreatment of Indigenous and local people around parks managed or co-managed by the World Wildlife Fund. These reports are horrifying. They include gross violations of human rights by park rangers tasked with protecting the park and its wildlife. Murder, gruesome torture, dozens of reports of rape, burning a village, killing men, women, and children, conducting night raids, and terrifying local community members. When I saw these articles, I immediately asked the committee to start an investigation. Anyone who has worked with me knows that I believe passionately we have to conserve nature in the United States and abroad, but any hint of abuse in the name of conservation simply cannot be tolerated. So I'm grateful that Chair Grijalva and Ranking Member Bishop did launch a bipartisan investigation into WWF's practices and the Department of Interior's administration and oversight of international conservation funding. To be perfectly blunt, I and others on this committee have been extremely frustrated with how WWF handled this situation. WWF knew about many of these allegations, and in fact, its internal investigations confirmed many of the reports. To give you fair warning, these reported incidents are graphic and jarring, but I feel it's necessary to properly illustrate the horrors that WWF knew was occurring. So we're going to provide some detail. In one report, park rangers in Salonga National Park whipped and raped 4 women carrying fish by a river. 2 of the women were pregnant. One later had a miscarriage. In another case, a 52-year-old woman said she was arbitrarily detained and raped for 2 consecutive days, and her husband had to pay a fine to secure her release. Another victim alleged that he and several other men were detained while fishing and were tortured by rangers, beating them, tying their penises with fishing line, hanging them by the branch of a tree. In other cases, victims were tortured and killed by rangers through beating and stabbings, and these were not isolated incidents. WWF's review found 21 accusations of murder in this one park alone. Most park rangers who perpetrated these acts were never brought to justice. Now, from the beginning, WWF has focused on elaborate excuses to distance itself from the allegations, pointing to the fact that they don't employ the park rangers. They are units of the government in the country in which they're operating, and that the political situations and corruption in these countries just makes things difficult. In one meeting, WWF actually mentioned that they would stop allowing park rangers to drive around in WWF labeled trucks because it confused the locals, as if that would fix the problem, as if the problem was just bad PR for WWF. WWF and other big name nonprofits bring large amounts of money into countries where they work. That can translate into political influence if they choose to use it. If organizations like WWF want to work in these places, they must be fully present active, and most of all, accountable. These allegations have also highlighted the continued impacts of colonialism in conservation. The old way of doing conservation, Westerners coming into a country, setting up a national park with strict borders, and ridding the area of its inhabitants, is still causing conflict today. If Indigenous and local community members no longer have access to their lands and the resources they provide, there can be conflicts between these local communities and the people protecting the park. Now, let's be very clear. The areas we are talking about today need protection and conservation. These areas have some of the richest biodiversity in the world. They are at risk from deforestation, mining, development funded by countries like Russia and China, and more. Wildlife trafficking originating in these areas supports international criminal activity and threatens our own national security. So we need to do this work, but we need to do it right. We need to stop thinking that a conservation park with heavily guarded borders will solve complex geopolitical issues. Conservation and community development must be integrated. You can't have successful conversation in these places without thinking about the people. So today we will talk about what happened and who needs to take responsibility for the actions of these park rangers. Unfortunately, WWF's president and CEO, Carter Roberts, declined to testify. He cited commitments in the lead up to the Glasgow UN climate meeting. I'll note that others participating in this hearing, including myself, have managed to appear in spite of that very same obligation. But instead of hearing from the CEO, we will hear from Jeanette Hemley, Senior Vice President for Conservation at WWF, and we'll hear about how they are changing their practices and if those changes are enough. You have so many outstanding questions. Can we trust WWF to fully deliver on their human rights standards across their entire organization? Are they improving reporting mechanisms, transparency, and accountability? Moving forward, what are they doing to invest in communities and effectively wield their political power in challenging places? And how can other organizations learn from all of this? We have the opportunity to start addressing human rights and oversight issues and to map out what our investments in conservation should look like in the coming days. I want to thank our witnesses for participating today, for helping our committee understand what a rights-based approach for conservation should be. This is a heavy, heartbreaking subject that we're tackling today, but I suspect it will leave us all a little bit uncomfortable, but hopefully will highlight solutions. If we're serious about human rights, if we're serious about conservation, we must work to find a pathway that elevates standards across the board to protect both people and nature. With that, I will turn it over to Ranking Member Benz for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for holding this important meeting. It's my understanding that the effort leading up to this hearing has been truly bipartisan in nature. Performing oversight and demanding government accountability are some of the most important functions of Congress, and of course, today's hearing is part of that effort. For the past 2.5 years, this committee has investigated whether taxpayer funds being sent overseas by the Department of the Interior have been used to inadvertently support, at least we hope it's inadvertent, support human right abusers. In short, that happened. A breakdown occurred where our government and international wildlife conservation organizations failed to follow where and how our taxpayer dollars were being spent. It's appalling that American funds were used for perpetration of human rights violations, something that unfortunately happens in a third world dictatorship. The atrocities are too disgusting to repeat again, Mr. Chair, but to its credit, the last administration's Interior Department initiated an internal review of its international conservation grants. As a result, upon its review, then Deputy Interior Secretary Kate McGregor issued a memo where she determined in part that, quote, additional controls are necessary and no further funding may be awarded until such deficiencies are corrected, end quote. I ask unanimous consent to enter that document into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a result, some of the grant funding was paused in 2019 until such reforms were made. This administration has released this funding, and we are awaiting documentation from the Interior Department to see what, if any, transparency and accountability measures have been put into place. Mr. Chairman, I hope you'll join us in making sure we receive those documents in a timely manner. I hope the day that we as a committee analyze past failings and examine potential solutions in preventing future atrocities. We have a number of witnesses before us today that will provide a genuine debate, which I hope helps us accomplish this goal. The Republican witness before us today, Mr. John Knox, a professor of law at Wake Forest University, will detail his unique background on this matter and will indicate what additional steps may be necessary. One such step is that we need to ensure that government agencies, both within Interior and the State Departments, are following the same process that prohibits financial assistance to recipients who have committed human rights violations. Without cross-agency coordination and our congressional oversight component, we could find ourselves in the same place again, wondering if and why taxpayer funds supported individuals who committed atrocities. Not only are future lives at stake, but the taxpayers have asked for deserve nothing less than us doing our job. I look forward to our discussion today. Mr. Chair, a couple of other remarks are in order. First, people are more important than animals. And I would suggest that conservation organizations have forgotten that. I want to hear today that somehow they've remembered it. Secondly, the World Wildlife Fund is not taking responsibility, and some of the phrases I've seen in their materials are embarrassing. And I hope today that they step up and actually admit that they are at fault. Finally, well, it's not finally, the money being used as a solution to all problems does not work, particularly in countries where predicting where the money is going to go is almost impossible. And so I look forward to hearing how people in these organizations that are taking our money and then using it prove to us that they're worthy of credibility in how it's being spent. Mr. Chair, I'm just appalled really at the word colonialism comes to mind, and I've seen it in a lot of the materials, and just to see how these people are being mistreated and to be justified by pointing at conservation is ridiculous. And I've seen this in many other places. I won't go into that now, but I'll just ask that these folks today that are responsible should take responsibility and then tell us how and why we should believe them when they come to us again for money. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member and share many of those sentiments. I want to remind everyone we're talking about a single conservation organization, and it's
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I think you're on mute. Oops, I guess you're not on mute. I don't have my earphones in.
Sorry, Ranking Member Benz. Just reminding us we're talking about a single organization. It does have a Byzantine network of affiliates and subsidiaries, but I would caution against extrapolating that all conservation organizations doing this work suffer from the same problems. With that, I would like to invite the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Grijalva from Arizona, to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, and thank you for at the time initiating and promoting the inquiry that the then ranking member Bishop and I undertook, and it's been frustrating, like you said, and I want to associate myself with your opening comments. I think you outlined where we're at, and you outlined the urgency, and I thought your last comment was very important. That this is not a retribution of international conservation efforts. This is about correcting, reforming, and doing what is necessary from our perspective as the funding source to end this abuse, the atrocities that you outlined, and other international bodies are looking into this as well. United Kingdom, Germany, and GAO, plus Interior Department, all doing separate investigations, and this committee. And I think legislatively, looking forward to what comes out from this. I expect that this hearing is going to inform us about what we in Congress should be doing to ensure accountability for taxpayer investments, both in conservation and elevating the role of human rights in these conservation efforts. So I will submit my opening statement for the record. And once again, Mr. Huffman, thank you, and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will now have an opening statement from the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Westerman of Arkansas. Mr. Westerman, are you with us? There we go. Go right ahead.
Can you hear me now, Mr. Huffman?
Yes, sir.
All right. Sorry about that. Oh, thank you, Chairman Huffman. And I also want to acknowledge the work that you and Ranking Member Bentz have done on this issue, and also the work that Chairman Grijalva and former Ranking Member Bishop did to set this in motion. And I'm pleased that we are having a hearing on it today. It's an issue that's resulted from a bipartisan investigation that has lasted for more than 2 years. And during that time, as Chairman Huffman mentioned, we have seen terrible reports of human rights violations, including murder, rape, and torture that's associated with international conservation efforts. Many of these efforts were funded by U.S. taxpayers, and the government was often unaware that these human rights violations were occurring. The bottom line is we've learned that current accountability measures are just not sufficient to ensure that the Interior Department's partner organizations and their sub-grantees do not inadvertently support human rights abuses abroad in the name of species conservation. Today's hearing title references the need to promote human rights. Based on thousands of pages of documents and countless briefings with the government and various stakeholders, it's clear to me that we not only need to promote human rights and international conservation, but we also need to protect these rights. Protecting human rights of vulnerable and indigenous people abroad begins with holding Department of the Interior grant recipients accountable for their actions and that of those they support with taxpayer funds. It also begins with the department ensuring that proper accountability and reporting mechanisms exist to prevent future instances of these atrocities. Both of these starting points demand transparency. As we discuss these issues in Washington, D.C., it's important to remember that innocent people in some of the most remote areas of the world were routinely victimized by so-called echo guards for decades. We will likely never know the actual number of victims or crimes that go unreported. Of those that we do know from our investigation, internal reports from the World Wildlife Fund contain examples of echo guards raping mothers in front of their children, forcing a young man to eat raw bushmeat, and torturing a man based on false allegations of poaching while all he had done was go fishing. Unfortunately, where the accountability falls for these gross violations of human rights is often muddled. There is a broken chain of responsibility when it comes to determining which grant recipients, sub-grantees, supported human rights violations. The chain of irresponsibility flows from the funders to grant recipients and then to their sub-grantees, and changes are needed at every level. Alarmingly, the department appeared to rely on grant recipients themselves to audit the use of funds, and in turn, officials at the department were surprised by allegations of human rights abuses raised by our committee and the media's investigations. This leads us to the role grant recipients play in responsible management of international conservation grant funds. As the committee probed WWF for explanations about their support of echo guards in connection to human rights abuses, WWF U.S. officials explained that they subgranted these funds to other WWF entities, which they noted as separate independent organizations. This confusion of responsibility also mirrors a similar issue highlighted by WWF's own independent review, where a lack of ownership was found across the various WWF organizations when attempting to pinpoint who was accountable for the implementation of WWF's social policies, including those meant to protect human rights. Shockingly, according to Mr. Knox's testimony, WWF took actions that weakened their human rights commitments. This is certainly a step in the wrong direction. I urge WWF to take Mr. Knox's feedback on the response to the independent review seriously. Unless WWF addresses these shortcomings, I fear they will continue to perpetrate this chain of irresponsibility that results in the suffering of indigenous peoples abroad. The consequences of failing to protect human rights in our conservation efforts will result in continued human rights abuses at the hands of echo guards, while indigenous peoples pay the price for our failure to act. We must break this chain and ensure conservation efforts do not occur at the cost of human lives. As highlighted by Ranking Member Bentz, our investigation also uncovered failings at the Interior Department. The Trump administration took the initial step to pause funding for some of these international conservation grants until appropriate oversight mechanisms could be implemented. Lives of human beings depend on our ability to continue efforts to improve accountability and transparency mechanisms in our international conservation efforts. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. We will now hear testimony from our witnesses. Before introducing the witnesses, I want to remind our witnesses that they are encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. You may refer to your hearing invitation materials for further information about that. Under our committee rules, we ask you to limit your oral statement to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement, however, will appear in the hearing record. And when you begin speaking, the timer will start counting down. It turns orange when you have 1 minute remaining. And I want to recommend that members and witnesses who are joining us today use the grid view in WebEx and lock the timer on their screen so that we can all be mindful of the time. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself. By the way, the flip side of that is when I recognize you, please unmute yourself so we can hear you. But after you're finished, please do mute yourself to avoid inadvertent background noise. I will allow all the witnesses to testify before we bring it back to the members for questions. We will begin today with testimony from Mr. Kadu Sabunye, CEO of African Wildlife Foundation. The chair now recognizes Mr. Sabunye to testify for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I'm Kadu Sabunye, CEO of African Wildlife Foundation, a conservation organization headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya. Thanks for the opportunity to testify today on protecting human rights in the international conservation. As African Wildlife Foundation, our sphere of focus is Africa. We have 60 years history of advancing African-led conservation, working with local communities, governments, civil societies, and the private sector, among other constituencies. We believe strongly that interventions to conserve nature and natural resources are linked to people's rights to secure their livelihood, enjoy healthy and productive environments, and live with dignity. Protecting and restoring nature underpins human rights. Therefore, the pursuit of conservation should never be attained at the expense of rights of people, particularly the underprivileged and marginalized rural communities, whom I refer here as indigenous and local communities. In 60 years of conservation work in Africa, African Wildlife Foundation has experienced firsthand and fully acknowledges that poorly planned and executed conservation activities can negatively impact Africa's people. Over the decades, we have evolved based on our experiences. We are constantly learning to improve our approaches and do our work better. Safeguards against human rights violations in conservation are critical. This calls for the need for continued human rights due diligence in planning, in financing, and implementation in overseas conservation programs. This is important, especially in Africa, because the history of creating many of Africa's protected areas is littered with forced relocations, restricted access, and the marginalization of African people, in particular rural communities. The dominant ideology relied historically on exclusion and hardline preservation, cementing the fortress approach to conservation and disconnecting many African people from nature. It's no accident, Mr. Chairman, that those initially involved in creating protected areas in Africa found lands traditionally owned and inhabited by indigenous peoples and local communities that overlapped and retained the highest level of biodiversity. Exclusionary conservation approaches deployed alienate many African people from wildlife. Today, for continual improvement of commitments to human rights in conservation, the United States Congress can build a mechanism such as the layer process to strengthen safeguards to help avoid violations of human rights in conservation. But equally important is that congressional leadership can influence the adoption of improved standards and mechanisms that promote human rights-based approaches in conservation and improvement in practices across the globe. Notably, the following underpin our recommendations. Pulling away or limiting US support will undermine improvements in security and have come from conservation interventions in our areas where we work. Limiting US involvement where there are violations is likely to do more harm. Policies and mechanisms for improved safeguards also need to address indigenous people and local communities' engagement in decision-making to stop continued sidelinings. To stop and avoid future human rights violations, safeguards must incorporate training and other mechanisms to improve professionalism. Balancing punitive measures, commitment, and improvement of professionalism and practices, which include readdressing measures for this unit to improve their professionalism. In closing, we welcome congressional actions towards addressing shortcomings in conservation. US support is critical to ensure conservation efforts are prioritized and remain viable, particularly in some of Africa's most troubled countries and areas. But I will emphasize, Mr. Chairman, that stepping away for US government or cutting support and funding, blacklisting and sanctions cannot be the only recourse. We cannot allow indifference or afford inaction, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, sir. The committee will next hear testimony from Ms. Jeanette Hemley, Senior Vice President of Wildlife Conservation at World Wildlife Fund, U.S.
Chairman Huffman and Grijalva and Ranking Members Bentz and Westerman, thank you for the opportunity to testify today at this very important hearing. I have worked for more than 30 years on global conservation, developing and directing programs to conserve threatened species and habitats, working with local communities, NGOs, the corporate sector, and governments. In this work, I and WWF have valued our partnership with U.S. agencies such as the Fish and Wildlife Service. WWF's global network of organization works in 100 countries, including in areas facing extreme poverty, violent conflict, corruption, and weak governance, all forces which can lead to violations of human rights. In remote regions like Africa's Congo Basin, indigenous people and local communities rely on the natural resources and wildlife around them. Despite often challenging circumstances, WWF works to support those communities, to help them secure their health and well-being and improve their livelihoods while protecting the nature they depend on. Of particular relevance to this committee are efforts to prevent the illegal trade in wildlife and other natural resources. This ruthless business generates billions of dollars for transnational criminal networks that wipe out endangered species, destroy forests, and victimize indigenous peoples and local communities. At the forefront of efforts to prevent these crimes are government park rangers. Many are themselves members of local communities and indigenous groups who often work for low pay with little support and in extremely dangerous conditions. In the last decade, almost 1,200 rangers have died worldwide in the line of duty, and 143 have died this year alone, mainly from homicide. This is intolerable. It's also true there have been instances of government park rangers committing human rights abuses. This is intolerable, and we've heard reports and citations of some of these instances that are horrific. WWF condemns human rights abuses wherever they occur and is firmly committed to doing all it can to support communities and hold governments accountable in their obligations to protect human rights. When WWF became aware of such complaints in the past, we took action, including setting up community complaint mechanisms and providing human rights training to rangers in countries such as Cameroon and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Our responses, however, were not as systematic as they should have been. In 2019, a number of allegations were raised about abuses by park rangers in several African and Asian countries where WWF works. As we promised the committee then, we commissioned an independent panel of experts to review WWF's response, which was chaired by former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, and included one of my fellow witnesses today, as has been noted, John Knox. Last November, we shared with you the panel's findings and WWF's detailed management response. These were also made public. I have included links to both in my written testimony and ask that these be made part of the hearing record. Importantly, the panel found no evidence that WWF staff were involved in the alleged abuses, and WWF had no direct management responsibility for the government rangers implicated. It also found that WWF had strong human rights policies in place, but said WWF needed to do more to ensure they were consistently put into practice on the ground, including strengthening its systems to manage risks and ensure community complaints are addressed. It also said that we needed to do more to engage governments to uphold their human rights responsibilities. The panel made 79 recommendations, which WWF has embraced and is working strongly to implement. My written testimony contains significant details on this work, but among the key actions to date, we have created a strengthened environmental and social safeguards framework to identify and address risks in the places where we work. The panel called this a major step forward in ensuring a consistent and coordinated approach on safeguards across the WWF network, thereby ensuring better compliance with human rights and other social policy commitments. We have hired a global ombudsperson, the first such position in the conservation community, who can cut through red tape, engage with communities, and ensure that our policies aren't just on paper, but operational on the ground. And we are working with the International Ranger Federation and other partners to professionalize and upgrade the standards of the ranger sector worldwide, including to ensure that government rangers are accountable in carrying out their duties. Our experience has reaffirmed several core principles on how to advance human rights and conservation together. One, it is essential to involve Indigenous peoples and local communities as core stakeholders and leaders throughout projects, and to understand their customary and legal contexts and rights, and to account for these. Governments must uphold their duty to protect human rights and be held accountable when they do not. Protections and effective systems need to be in place to ensure community concerns and complaints are addressed. Third, we must upgrade the support and standards and training systems for rangers where needed. And fourth, all third parties involved in conservation projects need to respect human rights and to use their leverage and influence to hold governments to account for their obligations to protect people.
Thank you, Ms.
Mr. Chair.
Hemley. We will have plenty of time in the question session for you to elaborate on any of those points or other things you want us to know. The committee will next hear from Ms. Joan Carling, Global Director of Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. Chair now recognizes Ms. Carling to testify for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish to express my sincere appreciation to this subcommittee for taking this positive and bold step towards a stronger protection of human rights in international conservation. I am humbled by this invitation for me to take part in this important hearing. As an Indigenous activist, I've been working with Indigenous communities adversely affected by the designation and management of conservation areas in their territories often declared as national parks. I was shocked and angered by the killing of an Indigenous activist in Thailand, who we were assisting as a victim of unjust eviction and burning of their houses in the Kaeng Krachan National Park. I was also involved in raising awareness and attention to the forced displacement of Indigenous peoples in India for the expansion of the Tiger Reserve jointly managed by the Government of India and WWF. Based on my personal experience and the work of my organization on conservation, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, the prevailing fortress conservation approach is resulting to massive violation of individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. These violations include killings, torture, unjust arrest and detention, violence against women, criminalization, among others. This approach is also resulting to the hunger and malnutrition of Indigenous children, widespread poverty, increased vulnerability of women to sexual abuse and conflicts. This historical and colonial approach of biodiversity conservation remains as the dominant framework by many states and their partner conservation organizations. In the recent years, there have been a groundswell of demands by different bodies and the UN officials for human rights-based approach to conservation. This call includes the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples based on her report on conservation and Indigenous peoples in 2016, the recent policy brief of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, and more than 150 NGOs. This demand is likewise supported by the evidence that ecosystems managed by indigenous communities are better conserved than those by states and others. This is because of our intergenerational relations to our environment and our practices of reciprocity, sustainability, and conservation for the future generation. Indigenous peoples' lands intersect with around 40% of all protected areas and more than 65% of the most remote and least inhabited lands on Earth. The protection of indigenous peoples' rights to our customary lands is thereby essential for the protection of the world's biodiversity, the conservation of threatened ecosystems, and the restoration of degraded lands. Under a human rights-based approach to conservation, key elements of the land rights standards developed by indigenous peoples' organizations and advocate groups should be considered in developing a legislative action for the protection of human rights in international conservation. I have provided in my longer testimony the relevant elements of the land rights standards that can be included in a legislative action for the protection of human rights in international conservation for your consideration. The positive action of the US Congress in developing and adopting a legislation to protect human rights in international conservation will set a mandatory framework and a standard that shall transform the behavior of key actors in the conservation community. This will be a game changer as it will impel them to put into practice the needed human rights due diligence for them to be able to receive financial support. This would also build the necessary requisites for these actors to establish respectful and meaningful partnerships with indigenous peoples as stewards of nature. Likewise, a strong legislation on the protection of human rights and international conservation will also set a positive precedent for other states to follow in providing financial support to international conservation. More importantly, this will further enable indigenous communities to fully exercise and enhance our conservation practices for the benefit of the present and future generation. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to engage with you in a constructive exchange. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll close with testimony from Mr. John Knox, Professor of International Law at Wake Forest University and former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. Mr. Knox, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak at this hearing. As you have heard, in 2019 and 2020, I participated in an independent expert panel that conducted an in-depth investigation of WWF's involvement in alleged human rights abuses in 6 countries, 4 in Central Africa and 2 in South Asia. I'm speaking today in my individual capacity, not on behalf of the panel, which ceased to exist upon the publication of its report in November 2020. WWF's statement to this subcommittee takes quotations from the panel report out of context and thereby gives a false impression of the panel's findings. It is frankly shocking to hear WWF portray the report as if it largely exonerated WWF. In fact, the panel found that WWF knew, often for many years, about alleged human rights abuses in the parks and protected areas it supports in each of these countries. WWF nevertheless continued to provide financial and material support. And most important, WWF often failed to take effective steps to prevent or respond to the abuses. My written testimony describes the report in detail. I'll just give one example here. WWF has co-managed Salonga National Park in the DRC since 2015. WWF appoints the park director and it pays the park rangers. Salonga is an example of fortress conservation. When the park was created, the government expelled the communities who used to live there. They now live around the outskirts of the park, and it's illegal for them to return to their ancestral homes. In 2016, a WWF staff member reported that Salonga park rangers were regularly accused of abuses against the local communities. The WWF country director and park director decided not to investigate because they wanted to avoid conflicts with the government. Only after NGOs made public allegations of abuse in the park did WWF commission an independent investigation, which finally took place in 2019, nearly 3 years after the staff member first raised the alarm. The investigators went to only a few of the hundreds of villages around the park, but they found multiple credible allegations of murder, rape, and torture. In fact, they concluded that rangers used torture and other cruel and degrading treatment as a regular part of their operations. WWF has never published this report. WWF continues to provide financial and material support to the park. The surrounding communities still don't have access to the park, and there's no reason to believe that the abuses have magically stopped. Unfortunately, this pattern is typical. WWF often fails to anticipate or respond to allegations of human rights abuses until the allegations become public, and then it characterizes its responses as far more effective than they actually are. Indeed, WWF's statement to this subcommittee shows that WWF's leadership is still in a state of denial about its own role in fortress conservation and human rights abuses. WWF is not alone. Many conservation organizations are very good at expressing support for Indigenous peoples that have fallen short in respecting their human rights in practice. I believe that organizations like WWF will not change their behavior until the United States and other donor governments force them to do so by withholding grants until they make the necessary changes. That means 3 things in particular. First, WWF needs to apologize for its involvement in past human rights abuses, take responsibility for its failures, and be open and honest going forward. A good starting point would be for WWF to commit here, today, to publish all of its internal reports on human rights abuses. It should never again be the case that the US government finds out about these abuses in parks that it supports only after they're reported in the press. Second, there should be clear red lines. Parks should not receive support unless they've demonstrated respect for Indigenous rights, effective training and oversight for park rangers, and access to complaint mechanisms for local communities. Finally, to receive funding for any purpose, WWF and other conservation organizations should demonstrate that they have expertise on Indigenous peoples and human rights compliance at every level of the organization, including at the top. It is highly symbolic, I think, that WWF rejected the panel's recommendation that it add representatives of Indigenous peoples to its international board. I again thank you for holding this hearing, and I hope and trust that it provides a basis for legislation that leads to the needed transformational change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Knox. I want to remind the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses, and I will begin by recognizing myself. Ms. Hemley, are you going to the Glasgow Climate Summit?
No, Mr. Chairman, I am not.
All right, thank you. I want to associate myself with the comments that Mr. Knox made about the fact that WWF, this is a frustration many of us have, WWF still doesn't seem to get it, that in response to this panel's investigation, WWF continues to portray this as largely exculpatory, something that exonerates them from accountability. I noted, Ms. Hemley, that you're very careful in how you describe these park rangers. Every time you mention them, you call them government park rangers. You might just as well mention that these are WWF trained and supported rangers driving around often in WWF branded vehicles in parks managed and funded by WWF, but you're much more careful in how you characterize them. And in fact, instead of pointing out that the panel's review found a number of damning facts, your testimony to this committee suggests, you lead off with this, you suggest that there was a bunch of exonerations. The first things you mentioned were the fact that the committee, the panel confirmed the rangers accused of abuse were employed and managed by governments, not WWF. That the panel found no evidence that WWF staff directed, participated, or encouraged human rights abuses. Found no evidence to support assertions WWF purchased or procured weapons for the rangers, as if those are the big takeaways from the panel's review. In fact, If you turn to what the panel actually found, let's start with Salonga National Park. It reads quite differently than what you have described. It points out that WWF appointed the park director and has had direction through that park director of the Eco Guards. WWF provided substantial technical and financial support to the Eco Guards. That before you entered the MOU, WWF was aware of the potential for human rights abuses by these Eco Guards. It goes on and on. In December 2016, WWF field staff reported allegations of human rights abuses to senior WWF officials who failed to act on it, and the panel finds that that failure to act was out of a desire to avoid upsetting the Democratic Republic of Congo's government. I could go on. There are a number of damning facts in there, and yet you'd never know it from listening to your testimony here today. So let me just ask you, do you believe WWF bears any responsibility for the abuses that happened in any of the parks that it manages or co-manages?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the question, and I know this is such an important issue. You know, I want to say first that, as I said in my testimony,
just yes or no, Ms. Hemley. It's a simple question. Does WWF bear any responsibility for the abuses at the parks you manage?
Mr. Chairman, there is no evidence. The panel found that WWF did not participate in or contribute to those abuses. We do, however,
You're declining to answer yes or no whether you bear any responsibility. I'm really not going to give up all my time for you to deflect and dissemble, ma'am, with all due respect. To our knowledge, not a single person in the leadership at WWF has lost their jobs or resigned over any of these incidents, including the people that panel found received allegations of human rights abuse and chose not to act on them. So not a single person within the WWF network lost their job. Is that correct?
We have made
yes or no question, ma'am.
We have new leadership in the Congo Basin in several countries,
no,
Mr. Chairman.
Please, you hear my question. It's a yes or no.
And I respectfully, I am responding to you to the best of my ability, sir. We have made substantial reforms in our programmatic work.
No, there you go again, ma'am. I'm asking, did anyone lose their job? Yes or no?
We have new leadership in parts of the Congo Basin, sir. And
I'm going to take that as a no. I can only take that as a no, and that itself is just remarkable. All right. Now, can you think of any other organization or institution in any walk of life, the corporate world, politics, national sports leagues, where horrific abuses happened under their watch and no one lost their job? Can you think of any example? Because I can't.
Mr. Chairman, these instances of abuse are horrific. There's no question about it.
And we're not going to just continue to provide you a platform to dissemble. Now, what about park rangers who committed these crimes or their managers? When we read the internal reports, it seems most of them still have their jobs. Is that true?
That is not true, to the best of my knowledge, sir. I can give you a specific example for Salonga National Park, which has been the subject of a lot of the discussion so far. It is our understanding that of the 21 eco guards that were implicated in abuses, 5 were convicted and sentenced to 2 to 20 years in jail. 10 were expelled from their agency, from ICCN, the park agency in the DRC. 5 have died, and of those convicted, 3 are appealing. And so that is the result of pressure from WWF, the German government, who's been a partner with us in Salonga.
All right, I appreciate that, and at least that is somewhat encouraging. I will close with this. Ms. Hemley, I want you to imagine for a moment that a member of your family had been subjected to the abuses that have been detailed here, torture, rape, murder, and yet not a single change was made within the organization that funded, oversaw, managed these park operations. Would you find that acceptable?
No, that is not acceptable, sir. And moreover, if you've read our management response and to the panel report, we have made fundamental changes at all levels of the organization.
Except for the personnel. Except for personnel.
have
Ms. Hemley,
changed.
thank you. I am out of time. I will yield to the ranking member and recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would ask unanimous consent that Congressman Gosar be allowed to sit with the subcommittee and participate in our meeting.
Without objection.
Thank you. Ms. Hemley, part of the problem I have with your proposed fixes to the problems that have been discussed is that you're dealing with third world nations. And I just wonder how much reliance anybody can put on those kinds of arrangements when the folks that you're dealing with are, in many respects, not accountable. So share with us, if you could briefly, why you think that these agreements that you're busy putting together have any merit whatsoever when the folks you're dealing with are, shall we say, challenged when it comes to governmental structure?
That's a very good question, Congressman. The work that we do in places that are difficult also is important to the people that live there, as well as the wildlife and the nature. I think our role as an NGO is to work with the people, support the people, and ensure that the programs we do put people in Indigenous groups first and foremost at the center. There are parts of the work that we do in places that are dealing with very difficult conflicts and political instability where it does work. In fact, it's worked with support from the US government. In the Central African Republic, for example, in a place called Zonga, where we've worked for 20 years, it is considered one of the most stable places in the country, according to the United Nations.
If I may, forgive me, because we just have such a short amount of time. I just want to say, it seems to me that qualifying all of your answers by saying to the extent allowed by the country in which we're operating would be a really good idea. And with that, I'm going to move to Mr. Knox. Mr. Knox, do you think that it makes any sense whatsoever to continue to give money or invest money, if you will, in these countries where the government structure is non-existent? And is there any way that anybody can make a promise about keeping people safe given that lack of governmental assurance?
I'm not suggesting that the United States government should cut off all conservation funding to all countries that have authoritarian or unstable governments. I do think, however, that the U.S. government needs to do much more than it has to make sure that that money is actually monitored and spent in ways that result in positive outcomes for conservation and for the indigenous peoples and local communities. These are challenging environments, but I want to be clear about this. That can't be an excuse for conservation organizations not paying sufficient attention to how the money is spent, and for them for governments too, not paying sufficient attention to how their money is spent. So I guess that would be my answer.
Let me hop to what appears to be a kind of an underlying justification for what's going on. It's almost like we're hearing, although it certainly isn't written down here, by these conservation organizations that, oh, sure, there are going to be abuses when we're involved, but they're far less than what would happen if we weren't there. True or false?
I don't know. I cannot say that that is true. In many of these situations, the eco guards, for example, are really only able to operate because of funding that they receive from conservation organizations. So in Cameroon, for example, I think it's pretty clear that the eco guard patrols and raids on villages were carried out only after getting approval from the funding organization here, WWF. In the DRC and Salonga, the eco rangers, the eco guards, basically weren't receiving any salary except from WWF. So I think I think this is part of why WWF and other conservation organizations in similar positions have to take responsibility. Without their involvement, without their support, in many cases, these eco guards wouldn't be functioning.
Let me hop to the accountability mechanism, because I am concerned about this trust us sort of a mentality that we see in some of the materials that I've reviewed. I don't want to trust anybody in this, but how do you? I know you went in and did a lot of work. How do we make sure in the future that this doesn't happen again? What's the best device available?
Well, I think I go into some detail about this in my written testimony, but I think one thing that has to happen is that the Department of Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service have to be under the same requirements as exist for Department of State and USAID, and those requirements have to be quite specific. Second, there has to be better monitoring by the US government. I think in the past, too often, they've simply taken the word of WWF and other conservation organizations. They shouldn't be doing that. They should be relying on other sources as well, independent sources. And third, again, there have to be consequences. If organizations that receive grant funding or other kinds of funding aren't reporting regularly, or their reports are inaccurate or incomplete, then there have to be consequences in terms of no longer providing the funding for that project, not at least through that, not through that recipient.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Benz. The chair now recognizes Chairman Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. Ms. Carling, we're days away from the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Scotland, and I understand you'll be advocating for Indigenous rights at this conference. And what specifically are you asking of world leaders as they chart the next climate action steps that have to be taken?
Thank you for that question. The big demand of Indigenous peoples in the climate change to have real solution is first to fully recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, especially since we are protecting many as 60% at least of the world's biodiversity, and we can only continue with that if our rights are fully recognized, particularly our land tenure, that we are able to exercise or continue the way we conserve biodiversity. Because if these lands and territories are threatened by even, like say, renewable energy and other projects, mining, if those will continue, then we will not be able to do that. Second is that we are at the time where as the IPCC report has indicated, this is a critical time to make sure that we deliver on the Paris Agreement. And the way we need to do that is really to cut carbon emission. And we expect states to really make the dramatic commitment to cut their carbon emission and support the transition, the just transition to renewable energy, but ensuring the respect again for Indigenous people's rights and for equity. Because without that, we will again be victimized by land grabbing in the name of windmills, in the name of solar farms. And that has to change. That has to change if we want effective solutions to climate change.
Thank you.
And finally, the issue of loss and damage and adaptation should be provided with the necessary financial support. And we believe the funds are there. It's not that we don't have the money. We have the money to support adaptation and loss and damages, especially in developing countries where majority of the Indigenous peoples are severely affected by climate change.
Thank you.
And we are at the front line of that.
Thank you very much. Let me ask another question. Thank you. Ms. Hemley, who was at the table to develop the update on social safeguards, management response to the investigation? Did the WWF include, in this instance, following up with the other question, Indigenous voices in that development? And yeah, that's the question.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Yes, indeed, we included Indigenous leaders. We included human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Global Witness, Rights and Resources Initiative. We consulted a range of important players to get an objective view and provide input and to scrutinize our own practices. We also held a public comment period, if you will, even though we're an NGO, to open up our policies and practices to the public in May and June of this year, and we received hundreds and hundreds of comments, including from Mr. Knox outside of his capacity as part of our independent panel. We welcome that input.
How does WWF feel about as we move through this, developing a legislative response to the issue, not just the issue of incentivizing, but the issue of putting restrictions on funding and fallback positions in terms of if violations occur around human rights and the involvement of Indigenous communities and transparency and accountability. How do you feel about funding going forward with those kinds of very specific, monitored restrictions and requirements being put onto funding?
We believe it's absolutely fundamentally important to ensure that the right kind of measures are in place to provide incentives and checks and balances against any potential abuses or misconduct by rangers and others against local people and Indigenous groups. We support
Okay.
taking action.
And those haven't, some of those haven't been in place in the past when the atrocities did occur. I think it would behoove all of us to look at a necessary independent third-party involvement in monitoring rather than the self-monitoring and self-reporting that has been going on primarily around those allocations. Am I wrong?
I think the agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service, does a very good job in managing its grants, but we could look harder at ways to make sure there's
Yeah,
consistency
I
across.
don't disagree. They manage them well. It's the issue that Mr. Huffman's hearing is about and Mr. Benson's hearing is about. It's not just managing the grant. It is in the long term assuring the taxpayers and the federal government and that that money is being used, not just managed, but it's being used in the right way, and that requires another level of monitoring and another level of oversight that I don't believe is present now. But with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just remarkable, the federal agency that did such a wonderful job that they didn't even know any of this was happening until we and BuzzFeed told them about it. That's the answer, apparently. So thank you for that illuminating line of questions. The chair now recognizes Mr. Carl for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Knox, in your experience, after your work on the independent panel, what challenges raised at today's hearings are unique to the WWF and which are found more broadly throughout the international conservation efforts?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a really good question. I think WWF is unique in some ways. It's very, very large. It has extended operations in more than 100 countries around the world. It also has an extremely complicated governance system that makes accountability much more difficult. I think it's fair to say that the panel report kind of illustrated that in many cases, different WWF offices essentially pointed fingers at one another in a kind of chain of irresponsibility, with each of them taking the position that it was another part of WWF that was really responsible for dealing with this issue. Not all conservation organizations, thankfully, are set up that way, so they don't all share that kind of problem. I think many, however, do share a different kind of problem, which is that in many ways they still are, let's say, committed at some level to this idea of fortress conservation. They pay lip service to a rights-based approach to conservation, but they haven't really added the expertise and the capacity internally to really change their behavior. I mean, I was heartened by the comments of Mr. Sabanu about African wildlife, but not all conservation organizations, I think, have really made those changes to what I would think of as kind of their organizational DNA that they need to.
One quick follow-up question. Do you see any signs of change in the international conservation organizations?
As my testimony, I think, makes clear, I've been very disappointed by the failure of WWF to make a sharp break with its past. I thought that the board's decision to appoint the panel in 2019 was a sign that it realized that fundamental changes were necessary. Unfortunately, that turned out not to be the case. And I do think that other international conservation organizations, some of them are in the same position as WWF or even farther behind. I talk with many people in conservation organizations at lower levels that understand that changes are necessary, and it's possible. I think that the next generation of leaders will bring that change with them. The problem, Representative, is that we don't have time to wait for the next generation of leaders. The species of the planet and the indigenous peoples need the change to occur now. WWF isn't really doing that. As the chair said, WWF is still relying on the same people that it relied on before. It's relying on a kind of system of internal volunteers, external consultants, and online training to actually implement its human rights commitments. That hasn't worked in the past, and I don't think it's going to work in the future. I just want to close, I guess, if I could, by just noting that WWF would never dream of having its organizational expertise on conservation depend primarily on a combination of outside consultants and internal volunteers. Conservationists at WWF, wildlife biologists, know very well how hard it is to develop expertise in those areas because they spent years doing it. And WWF should recognize that expertise on human rights and indigenous relations and local communities requires just as much education and practical experience, and hire people who have that level of expertise, including, of course, people who are actually members of indigenous peoples and local communities themselves.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to turn my remainder of time back over to Mr. Benz, if I could, please. Thank you.
Mr. Benz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And going and sticking with Mr. Knox for a moment, the question, follow-up question is, and you may have already said this, how do we here in Congress assure that that these things that we want done are being done? To whom do we look?
Well, I mean, I think there's kind of two levels of this, if I could, Mr. Ranking Member. I mean, one is Congress needs to get the executive branch, I think, to somewhat get its act together in terms of overseeing these kinds of grants, providing clear lines of responsibility, applying clear requirements, and then making sure that they're followed up in. But as I've said before, I do believe a big part of this is getting clear reporting from what's actually happening on the ground. And that means that the conservation organizations that receive the grants have to be willing to share bad news. The panel report described a kind of good news culture at WWF where program offices basically found it extremely difficult to pass on bad news to donor offices within WWF. And even at high levels, high staff levels, they found it difficult to pass on bad news to the international board. I gave examples of this in my written testimony. It's really hard. Sorry.
And thank you. We're out of time. Thank you so much. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir.
I thank the gentleman. Is Representative Dingell with us? She was next on my list if she is with us. And since I don't see her online right now, we will go to Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I shouldn't say pleased, I should say I'm absolutely shocked by the treatment of the human rights violations and the treatment of local indigenous communities that have been reported so far today. You know, throughout my time in Congress, Mr. Chair, I've been proud to lead efforts both promoting international human rights and international conservation. So it's devastating to hear some of the U.S. international conservation funds may have gone to groups on the ground guilty of what has been reported today, truly heinous atrocities. Because U.S. contributions to international conservation efforts are critically important and can not only help save threatened and endangered species, but also embolden local and indigenous communities. The moment it was clear that the U.S. was not adequately accounting for and tracking these funds, we should have immediately evaluated and improved these programs. Rather than doing the necessary work to see how such funds can elevate human rights, local indigenous communities, protect threatened species, hold the very folks in the wrong accountable. We know from the last administration that they use these allegations as a way to stop funding good conservation programs. So that was their response. I think that is not what we need to do to go forward. So my question first is to Mr. Sebonia. Mr. Sebonia, you have over 20 years of experience working in conservation from the grassroots level up to the national, regional, and international initiatives. I'd like to hear from you, first, one, the importance of U.S. government investments in international conservation efforts, and two, how can the U.S. government, through agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, how can they ensure greater transparency, accountability, and the need for a proactive approach to ensure not just that perpetrators are brought to justice, but how are we going to prevent injustices from ever occurring at all?
Thank you for the question, and it's a very, very good question, and it's really tied into a big part of my experience, 20 years experience, but a big part of that has been working under US government programs here in Africa and elsewhere, starting with a Peace Corps program involved in natural resource management assessments in a number of countries in Africa that led to formation of the ministers of environment in some of the countries in Africa, formation of the institutions that are now national environment management authorities in these countries. And what I'm alluding to here, Mr. Chairman, is that the US government involvement in building local institutions, whether it's government, whether it's support to local NGOs through the work of Peace Corps, or through holding accountable to some of the US agencies working in Africa, like US Forest Service and USAID. We're doing a wonderful job, but we need to streamline human rights resources. There will be a requirement for extra training. There will be a requirement in making changes in procurement mechanisms and systems that can hold accountable. In training for those who manage the monitoring so that we can streamline human resources. So my really simple answer is that we need a program from US government that really can address these issues, because there are so many players. There is government, host governments, there is NGOs like us, there are communities also themselves, the indigenous rural communities that will require training that can empower them to really actually even identify that their rights have been abused, and then create that environment. That has been done before here in Africa through US government funding on a number of institutions I've experienced working here. But I think for NGOs, we need to be the duty bearers in some of the work we do. We are the duty bearers. We are accountable to the work we do, and building systems within our systems, staff being trained to bear this is going to be very, very, very important. But we can't hold ourselves accountable on our own. We will need US government to come and support host governments so that they can hold us accountable. It's going to be very difficult for US government.
I've gone over our time. I want to thank you, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Gosar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, one of the worst parts of human rights violations has been discussed today is that all victims are among the most vulnerable people in some of the most remote parts of the world. These victims often have little recourse and their voices are diminished. I want to amplify the voice of just one of the many who have suffered at the hands of corrupt eco guards. Now I'd like to play the testimony of a Baca man from Cameroon who was victimized by the eco guards. Could you play that video?
And Mr. Gosar, we're going to try to do that. Full disclosure, we are a little concerned about the technical capacity for everyone to hear and see this, but we're going to give it a try.
Sounds good. Thanks.
benju awanyi e kema mema yiwe na eko na jali anagogbole atu kanal safari nagu alamba na ligi tangu bule kubatu ati kubatu bangu bula muko se ti karu me te bo alamba bude tenju la le tu alamba se ki mape kuna la lebu
Yes, come on in.
abule ke ima ke kutina ke kurangu bule ke jeli aduka awawe abele afi magweno pondo abele kama bi awalo nyonyi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, this man's testimony is based on abuses he suffered in 2017 in Lobeki National Park, the same year the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service awarded more than $2 million to the World Wildlife Fund, Wildlife Conservation Society, and Gabon's National Parks Agency, in part for, quote, strengthening and monitoring wildlife law enforcement, end quote, in areas including Lobeki National Park and its buffer zones. Mr. Knox, this example highlights the very problems we are discussing today. Can you describe how the victim's testimony compares with any allegations of human rights abuses that you reviewed in your work on the independent review panel?
Thank you, Representative. Well, in some ways, it's very typical. I mean, this is the kind of abuse that was described in many of the reports that we reviewed as part of the panel. I have to say, though, in some ways, this is many of the allegations of abuse were much worse than this. So in Cameroon, for example, a fairly routine type of abuse were that the Baca would be driven through the forest by machetes that were used as whips against them. In the DRC, Chairman Huff at the very beginning described some of the allegations there that really just amount to torture. Tying strings or ropes around men and women's, sensitive parts of their bodies and using that to torture them that way. And of course, some of the allegations are, some of the instances are even worse than that. Some of them, again, as has been said here already, involve murder and rape. So yes, I would say this is typical, except if you remember that many of the allegations are actually even worse than this.
Gotcha. Now, Mr. Knox, Ms. Hemley testified that the independent review panel stated that, quote, it is to the credit of the WWF Congo that it did take a number of positive steps to try to prevent human rights abuses after it hired a community conservation advisor in 2018, end of quote. You served on that panel. Is that a fair characterization of that panel report?
No, not really. I mean, the panel did praise the local office, which only had 8 people, for trying to do what it could. But it's important to recall the overall context here. WWF had been in the Mesok-Ja area working with the Congolese government since 2005. And since at least 2011, its goal had been to establish a national park there. It wasn't until 2017 that they got around to asking the local communities and indigenous people if they agreed. When it did do that, it didn't follow the correct procedures because the local office did not have sufficient guidance from WWF International, which was supposed to be overseeing and supporting them. So the quote is a little bit it is taken out of context. The panel was saying it's not the local office's fault, which was doing what it could. The responsibility, I'll just quote from the panel report, the responsibility, we said, must rest with WWF International and the network as a whole, which had committed to provide FPIC guidelines, but had not done so. The small ROC office had received insufficient guidance from WWF International or the national organizations engaged in the Republic of the Congo.
Well, you bring me right back to my next question. WWF provided the committee with an in-camera review of one of its reports investigating allegations of human rights abuses in Salonga National Park, which included multiple allegations of extrajudicial killings, torture, and rape. In Ms. Hemley's testimony, WWF states it is designing a grievance mechanism for the indigenous and local peoples in Salonga National Park. What is your reaction to this step by WWF?
I mean, I really want to emphasize this. WWF has been saying that they're designing this grievance mechanism for at least 6 years. I guess I'll say my reaction is I'll believe it when I actually see it on the ground.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired.
Thanks, Chairman.
And the chair now recognizes Mr. Cohen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That film of the gentleman that was abused was almost as bad, but not quite as bad as Officer Pannone being attacked here defending our capital by the insurrectionists on January the 6th. Mr. Sabunia, I've got a few questions for you. Are you with us?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned the Leahy process in your written statements, prohibiting the U.S. government from providing funds to assist foreign security forces where there's credible evidence the unit has committed gross violations of human rights. Do you think or know there any organizations that are currently receive funds for international conservation that should not be receiving them under the Leahy provision?
No, I think that is not going to solve the problem. That would be leaving and in my view, communities in a dire situation. One of the communities we work with and would like to see is a clear mechanism being built to support them. Conservation work supports their livelihood and is so important, especially in regards to the current changes going on in Africa, where economic decisions disregarding environment that are dire consequences of this continent. So the community is really, rather than abandoning them in that form, especially the agencies that are helping them, is really they would rather see mechanisms built transparently and them also trained so that they can hold those who are helping or supporting them do a better job, other than abandoning and asking them to pull out of the work.
So are you saying that there are no organizations that you think are getting funds that are committing gross violations?
I don't know, sir. It's from my experience. I don't know.
Okay, I appreciate that. Do you have ideas how to improve the Leahy process?
Yes, sir. I think that. Sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I think that the improvement really needs to start from the auditing on what's going on with the communities, and then the indigenous people. That is where we are going to build a system that represents their voice, represent their needs, and represent the pain they are faced with from the impact on so many things going on. Because not only conservation, we think that human rights abuse across the board. It's, whether it's mining companies or anyone else. So I think the first thing is really to do auditing the communities, feel their pain, understand where they are, and build a system that represents and addresses theirs. And then other players need to build their own systems, like we've done ourselves in improving how we address human rights issues within our institution, training staff, building a grievance redress mechanisms within us, strengthening our monitoring systems within our and holding our staff and ourselves accountable to it. But we cannot do it on our own unless also host governments and host institutions are equally built systems. And the US government has done that in other sectors. And I think US government can do a huge role in supporting these host institutions to do a better job on human rights, like you have in managing these areas, like you have in financial systems of these institutions.
Let me ask you this. This is a little different than the subject matter, but a lot of Americans, or some Americans, go over to Africa and kill animals, trophy hunters. Should the United States, is that a threat to the animals being extinct and killing elephants and lions and all for sport? Should the United States pass laws to restrict the importation of those animals into the United States to dissuade those people from going to Africa and killing these animals?
It depends what US government wants to do. If US government wants to stop the killing on the ground, that decision needs to involve institutions on the ground, needs to involve governments on the ground, needs to involve the indigenous people themselves, because there are some groups that are indigenous, that are benefiting from hunting. So I think the best solution would be that if that is to be discussed, if that has to be decided, who is on the table is going to be very, very important for US to reach the right decision.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Hemley,
Thank
is
the
my
gentleman.
time up?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr.
Unfortunately.
Chair. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Gonzalez-Colon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make questions to Mr. Knox, and thank you for coming. Throughout your written testimony, you discussed that one of the underlying causes of conflicts between park rangers and indigenous local communities is the restrictions on access to national parks and protected areas for substances and cultural activities. And one of my questions, and I saw the video Mr. Gozer play and many others, how can these restrictions on access have contributed to human rights abuses in areas in Africa, in Asia, and what we can do, and what policies can conservation organizations and governments adopt to properly address this and prevent these kind of abuses? And you saw the 2020 report of the U.S. Government Accountability Office that basically confirmed that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services does not have the necessary oversight mechanism in place to monitor international conservation grants and ensure they're not funding human rights abuses. So I want to know, the first question, and of course, in your experience and with your expertise, what concrete solutions can Congress and the U.S. government could enact to ensure there is appropriate oversight of federal funding for this international conservation?
Thank you very much, Representative. So to answer your first question, I think there's a direct connection between fortress conservation and the kind of human rights abuses that we're talking about. The problem is that many of these people are among the poorest people in some of the poorest countries in the world. They depend on the forests and rivers that have been their ancestral homes for their material as well as their spiritual and cultural well-being. When they're excluded from those places, they don't have good alternatives. It's not like they can go all get jobs in the city or something like that. So they naturally want to continue to rely on the forest as they have in the past. But the trouble is, if it's illegal for them even to go into the forest to do anything, and the eco guards, often poorly trained, are told, make sure you keep everyone out, then you're setting up a situation in which conflicts are, and I cannot emphasize this enough, inevitable between the local communities and indigenous peoples around the parks and the eco guards in the parks. There is no way there won't be conflicts, and many of them, unfortunately, will result in abuses. So it's vital that the indigenous peoples and local communities have access to their ancestral homes. That access does not have to interfere with conservation goals. On the contrary, often indigenous peoples are among the best at actually safeguarding the conservation values of what is, after all, their own homes. They're the ones who know how to take care of the animals. They're the ones who know if poachers are coming in. They have to be allies of conservation activities. It will simply not work otherwise. So to go to your second question, then what should the US government be doing more here, and what standards can it be employing? There actually are clear standards on the importance of making sure that indigenous peoples are not excluded from their traditional homes. And the US government should be checking, not just based on the Leahy vetting, but specifically it should be checking to make sure that the indigenous people and local communities do have access, that their rights of free, prior, and informed consent to any restrictions are taken care of and are honored. I think only if those things occur is it going to be possible to really get rid of these abuses.
Thank you. I want to yield the rest of my remaining time to the ranking member.
Thank you. Congresswoman Gonzalez-Colon, very much. So this is a question for Ms. Hemley. The independent expert panel report described several investigative reports that WWF had previously commissioned, which described widespread allegations of human rights abuses in the Congo Basin parks. Did WWF provide all of those reports to the U.S. Department of the Interior?
Thank you, Congressman. We did, and I want to just emphasize that those reports were produced by external experts for the precise purpose of documenting problems so that they could aid in prosecutions by governments in the countries in question. But we did share those reports with the Department of Interior and with this committee.
There was some suggestion that some were, but not all. Are you sure that all of them have been so shared?
My understanding is that we did share them all. One, as referenced earlier, we shared in camera, if you will. So we provided an opportunity for both the Interior Department and committee staff to review them to that particular one.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Land and species conservation are fundamental to preserving our planet. This is a noble goal, and it requires it's a tremendous undertaking that requires credible resources and responsibilities. So many of these contributions come from wealthy, developed countries like the United States, and so many conservation lands are still in developing countries, lands occupied by indigenous peoples. The greater good is achieved through these conservation lands, but the greater good also sometimes limits local exploitation of the land. Some restrictions may exist on hunting, fishing, mining, farming, and other exploitations. These restrictions must be balanced, and they must also be reasonably enforced. The enforcement is dangerous work. Value of lions, tigers, rhino, and elephant tusks, among other large game, are astronomical. Add in corruption in some of these countries, and we see a volatile situation. On the other hand, basic fishing and other local community food gathering and hunting needs must be allowed where feasible. A strong response is reasonable when they're faced with deadly force, but a peaceful response is warranted when an intrusion is minor. Ms. Hemley, what is the appropriate response when there's a minor intrusion, such as fishing or hunting of non-endangered game?
We believe that it is important for communities to have access rights, and where those rights have been taken away, that they should be restored. It's a complicated equation working with governments to do that, but I can tell you that in Cameroon, we have worked to help the Baca people gain access to 3 national parks where it had been previously taken away. We are working in the Salonga area to help communities get access to the periphery of the park for those very reasons, to access resources, to feed themselves for hunting and fishing and collection of forest products.
And Ms. Hemley, since my time's limited, what's WWF doing going forward regarding training and discipline to ensure an appropriate response going forward for these minor infractions?
We're working with governments like the Democratic Republic of Congo and their agency to ensure that there are clear codes of conduct for rangers that include disciplinary measures for any misconduct or bad behavior or illegal activities. We're doing the same in the Republic of Congo to ensure that there are also independent observers on patrols of rangers, so that there can be a more careful watch on the activities. And each situation is quite different, but we have put this at the center of our priorities. It was recommended in the panel that Mr. Knox sat on, and we've provided a number of steps and are taking them to address those in the unique circumstances of those countries.
Continued training, discipline, appropriate responses when these outrages happen and will be critical going forward, Ms. Hemley. Mr. Knox, sometimes these interactions between security forces and poachers can turn deadly. What are some of their appropriate responses when faced with a deadly force, a very difficult situation going forward?
Some of the,
what are the appropriate responses when you're facing
responses by the eco guards or by the
eco guards when faced with poachers that are exhibiting potentially murderous responses to try to poach big game?
Of course, they have to use force to protect themselves and the animals that they're charged with protecting. I don't think anyone's really disputing that.
I'm just making a point out that this is a dangerous area. I appreciate that,
Absolutely.
Mr. Knox. Mr. Sabunia, what advice do you have going forward? We heard a little bit from Mr. Knox already on that balance between allowing sustainable hunting, gathering, and fishing versus protection of conservation lands. Where is that balance do you think?
I think the balance is in empowering communities and indigenous people to take control of those systems. They are the ones that directly depend on nature, their livelihoods. They know how to do this over centuries. So I think the really crucial, important thing is to empower the people living near these resources to manage them as in their own rights and manage the environment as well, something they've been doing for many years and doing very well.
Mr. Carlin, Ms. Carlin, since I have very little time, do you agree with Mr. Savuna's statement? You're on mute.
Are you asking Mr. Knox? Or I'm sorry.
I agree.
Ms. Carlisle.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
agree.
Thank you. My time's expired.
All right, I thank the gentleman. A few of us have some additional questions, so we'll begin a second round. I don't think very many members will join in, but I do want to continue. And so I'll recognize myself to begin that round. And Ms. Hemley, we've asked you some hard questions today. I'm sure it has not been pleasant or comfortable. I tried in my opening statement to make the point that the work that WWF and other NGOs do in this space of international conservation is vitally important. It's really important. There are a number of great things that happen in the name of international conservation. You have dedicated your career to this cause, and that's a wonderful thing. But surely you also see that the strange refusal to be more accountable and candid from WWF is leading to some collateral damage in this field. The last administration cut off a whole bunch of conservation funding that affected other NGOs doing this work, not just WWF. You heard the ranking member in his opening remarks extrapolate that maybe all conservation organizations don't understand that people are more important than wildlife. And of course, there were a number of questions about simply cutting off international conservation funding as a response to these incidents that happened under WWF's watch. So I just want to ask you, as someone who's dedicated your career to this cause and seeing so much that is being put at risk right now, does that trouble you?
You know, these stories, these reports have deeply troubled me as someone who has dedicated my life to this work. In WWF, you know, I've also seen profound change in the last 2 years.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, but again, you're not answering my question. I'm not asking about the stories and the reports. I'm asking about the collateral damage that is happening right now in the Congress and beyond, where international conservation funding is potentially being put at risk because so many people are frustrated and exasperated and incredulous about WWF's failure to take responsibility. You wouldn't answer a simple yes/no question about whether you bear any responsibility, much less provide the apology that Mr. Knox and others have requested. Does it trouble you that this reaction to the way you've handled this is putting international conservation funding itself at risk?
Mr. Chairman, we have taken responsibility. We have made reforms. We have overhauled how we work on the ground to put communities at the center. We put safeguards in place. We've hired an ombudsperson. We've added capacity, contrary to what Mr. Knox has said. We have added capacity in human rights. We have added capacity on safeguards. You know, we do want to be responsible. We're dedicated to these places. That's why I do this work personally. We're dedicated to the people and the wildlife and these wonderful forests. So, you know, I would ask that you look at what we are doing, and you know, on the ground. We'd be very pleased to speak with you separately about all the changes we're making. We hope it can inform the
Ms. Hemley,
conservation
with all due
community
respect,
and-
your CEO did try that. He tried the goodwill tour, came into my office, and frankly, we have no shortage of, you know, happy talk. What we're missing is the direct accountability and transparency that others have been discussing. And I would just submit that it not only presents collateral damage for a lot of NGOs who are trying to do this work to the highest standards, it potentially creates a race to the bottom, because if other NGOs that are working in this space see that WWF can violate our standards and sensibilities and then just do a PR tour without changing any personnel that's kind of a race to the bottom, and that's not what we want here. So I'm going to conclude by going back to Mr. Knox. Your testimony, frankly, sir, has been really refreshing. And you have made the point that we should not be ceasing the support and funding for this work. It's vitally important, but we have to hew to very high standards. If you were in charge, if you could decide how WWF responded, rewinding back to 2019 or before, what should have happened in your expert opinion?
Well, I give you, I mean, the panel report is, of course, 160 pages long with lots of recommendations. Let me sum it up really briefly. I think WWF needed to change fundamentally its personnel involved in making these decisions. They have not built the capacity. The response to the panel makes clear that the way that they're trying to build the capacity is by adding a few people in a few positions, but they're not really adding the human rights capacity at all levels that they need. They haven't made the changes at the top that they need to make. They need to bring in new voices to their board to start with, and those new board voices need to include Indigenous and local community voices. Some of the things that I think that happened in the past would not have happened if their board had included those kinds of voices. And they just have to change what you've described, sir, as this happy talk. There are more examples that I had a chance to respond to just today, just to give one more. The idea that this consultation that they did for their new safeguards was a wide consultation is simply not the case. They adopted the new safeguards in June 2019, shortly after the BuzzFeed articles came out. The consultation that they did this year in 2021 was over safeguards that they had already put in place 2 years ago. I mean, I don't know what to say other than those things. Build the capacity, be more honest and open about the problems they face and take responsibility, and then go forward on that basis.
And so many of the responses perpetually being designed and developed and considered, but not actually implemented. Thank you, sir, very much. I yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this additional opportunity for questions. And I just have really one question for Mr. Knox, and it's consistent with what you just asked. I found on pages 6, 7, 8, and 9 of Ms. Hemley's presentation a list of all the things that they propose to do to try to fix the situation. And I just asked Mr. Knox if any of those address this, quote, human rights capacity, I think is what you just said was missing. So do any of those, there's actually 11 bullet points there. And do any of those hint that they're going to achieve what you said is missing?
Well, so for example, appointing an ombudsperson, I think could be a good thing. They first announced that they would appoint an ombudsperson in June 2019. She finally took office in August 2021. I mean, I don't think has been a sense of urgency about that there needs to be. That certainly could be a step in the right direction, though. I don't want to say that it's not. But again, the problem is on the ground in these places. WWF does not have the right expertise on the ground, as well as at higher levels, but especially on the ground to actually carry out the commitments that they've made. And as a result, again, information gets fed up that's not accurate. If I could just give one example, the statement that Ms. Hemley just made about WWF providing access to the parks in the Cameroon based on the February 2019 MOU is simply not the case. There was an MOU in February 2019. I want to be clear about this. It was delayed for 10 years, at least, after the Baca were told that they would have access. The MOU, when it was finally adopted, still didn't clarify what their access was. It said that action plans would be developed. I just talked to someone yesterday on the ground in Cameroon who said the Baca still don't have access. It's essentially a paper promise that hasn't been implemented. That's the kind of thing that has to change, and it won't change until the right people are in place.
Right. I think with that, Mr. Chair, that's my last question, so I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Mr. Lowenthal, you're recognized.
Mr. Chair, and I would like to ask Ms. Hemley, and Ms. Hemley, I'm just interested in some more of the specifics of what WWF is actually doing now. And to better track and report, I would like to know, how is WWF tailoring its international conservation and reporting mechanisms to protect the specific needs of each diverse community? Will WWF include mechanisms to include whistleblower complaints and tips? How will WWF measure the effectiveness of these new mechanisms that they're supposedly putting into place?
We're putting in place, as we've committed, so-called grievance mechanisms and complaints mechanisms in all the landscapes and seascapes where we work in high-risk countries. We are doubling down on efforts there to put more than just at the country level. We have in place now new protocols for escalation of complaints when they are serious. And our Ombudsperson, who was appointed a couple of months ago, has been hired to help address those when needed, when they can't be resolved. And I think the reforms that we've put in place are going to really help address some of the issues. And ultimately, the goal is to prevent these human rights abuses in the places where we work in the future. We're committed to making them work. We're monitoring them closely. We're going to report on them publicly. And to go forward, we want to make these places safer for the people as well as the wildlife who live there, and that's our goal. We'll have to report back to this committee as we make progress. We'll issue a summary of our 1 year progress at the end of this year. And it would welcome engaging in further conversation, as well as discussing how legislative approaches can also help address these really important issues.
Well, then I have one follow-up question, Ms. Hemley. Should similarly effective reporting mechanisms also be included by the Fish and Wildlife Service to increase their transparency and accountability?
I think that deserves a good look, Congressman, to see where we could strengthen those as well, certainly, and looking across the agencies that work together in these difficult places to ensure there's a coordinated system. The Leahy process, the Leahy vetting process, we have ideas of where that could be strengthened as well, and so we would welcome the chance to discuss those and offer suggestions from our experience.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony. I want to thank the members for some excellent questions. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for our witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing under Committee Rule 3.0. Members must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days to allow for responses. Going forward, we will see legislation in response to these matters that we've been discussing today. And I thank the ranking member for engaging in a bipartisan spirit. I'm sure that legislation will be strongly bipartisan. And I want to thank the committee staff for their incredible diligence and work in bringing us this far and in developing that legislation that will be forthcoming. So if there's no further business, and seeing none, then without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thanks, everyone.